Okay. Well, now that we're all in, cheers for sorting that out, Alice. I think we'll kick this off. So, yeah, welcome to everyone who's joined us so far. So I'm happy to be hosting our second Twitter Spaces. I think we'll start with some quick introductions. So I'm Rob. I'm the CTO and one of the co-founders of Haystack. I'll be hosting tonight's discussion. That's going to be about landing a job in tech and the various elements, hurdles, stages, etc., that we should think about on the way to nailing the interview and landing that next opportunity. So I've got the pleasure of introducing two guests. So we've got Gavin Hope, who's a senior software engineer and manager at Waters, and we've got Asher Mitilinakis, who's currently a software engineer. Asher, let me know if I've messed up your second name there.
No, I was going to say that's spot on.
Okay,
I don't know
good.
how you've done that first time.
Okay, well, pure fluke on my part. So we're off to a flying start. Good. So yeah, Gavin and Asher are going to sort of lend their insights and answer some questions posed by me, and then anyone listening who'd like to ask anything, we do some questions at the end. So Asher, maybe if we start with you, can you give us a bit of an introduction to yourself, maybe a little bit about your experience in tech so far, and how you got there?
Absolutely. So yeah, I'm Asher. I'm currently a front-end engineer at a small development agency called Parsons Media. Didn't sort of go to uni, get a degree or to a boot camp, anything like that. My background's actually, I spent 5 years in recruitment, essentially coming straight out of school and going to work because I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, and I just wanted some work experience. And it was my mum who actually recommended I get into recruitment. She was a recruitment manager years ago, and she sort of suggested it just to get out there, build up your communication skills, work with people, make some money at the same time, and just essentially see where the path leads. So I started off working for Adecco, who are one of the biggest recruitment companies in the world, and I was just placing candidates there essentially on a permanent and contract basis. Nothing specialist, just very commercial type roles. So I was working with a lot of like admin roles, office managers, that type of thing. And after a few years at Adecco, I wanted to essentially go a little bit more specialist and focus on tech, which was always an interest of mine. So I found a job at a small IT recruitment agency in London. And essentially at first there, I was recruiting cybersecurity specialists. So I got very invested in IT security, learning about sort of phishing, malware, everything like that, and placing candidates essentially throughout the UK and some in Europe as well. And I had a couple of long-term clients who wanted me to branch out and deal with some of their software engineering roles, as they told me that software engineers are generally quite hard to find, which I didn't believe them at first and sort of found out afterwards how true that was.
Yeah, so, definitely. Yeah.
So I started placing software engineers in London and Europe, got talking to a lot of them literally all day long, learning about, the projects they're working on, the languages they're working with, some of their goals and aspirations, things like that, and just became very invested in software engineering. And to get a better understanding of it, I took a course on Udemy just to try and understand the tech side of things better, so I could have better conversations with them and understand sort of clients' needs more. And as I was doing that, this was sort of 2019, I just essentially in my spare time just kept becoming more and more interested in software engineering as a potential career path. I was sort of, I wouldn't say getting tired of recruitment, but I was getting maybe to an age where you think now is a good time for a change and try a different path, whilst you're still young. Not that I think age that matters at all in terms of changing careers or anything like that. But I think it was a good point to take a step back and maybe try a different career path. So I quit my job end of 2019, and I thought I'm just going to study for 3 or 4 months flat out, start applying for jobs after that. And around the time when I was going to start applying for jobs, it was that's when lockdown hit. So I had a bit of a nightmare with that, trying to find work, but eventually found a contracting role at a AI company based in London as a junior software engineer. And that was beginning of 2021. So beginning of last year, 7-month contract I spent there just learning essentially the fundamentals of software engineering within a professional role. I left there I was doing a bit of freelance work for Parsons Green Media on the side, and things were going quite well with them. And so when my contract came to an end, they offered me a full-time role. I've been there ever since. And that's kind of the journey so far.
Yeah, great. So you got quite a unique experience in as much as you've seen kind of both sides, I suppose, of the interview process, or at least the sort of recruitment process.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you found that's kind of been a bit of a? Did you feel like you were starting with a bit of a leg up?
You'd think so, but I was applying for jobs in tech throughout the beginning of lockdown when things were, I guess you could say that there wasn't necessarily that many jobs going, and I feel like a lot of people were looking, but I wasn't hearing back from a lot of people just due to, I think, lack of experience and the fact that it was very competitive at the time. So I thought it'd give me an advantage. I think timing wise, it ended up helping, but overall, it still took me quite some time to find that first role. But definitely a few like tips and tricks I learned from the recruitment side helped.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure. Yeah, I think at that point there's probably quite a lot of confusion in the market. People weren't quite sure what was happening. I think tech found its feet quite fast afterwards, and as with the kind of dispersed workforces and people working from home, working remote. But yeah, at that point, right at the start of 2020, the start of the pandemic, that must have been quite a tricky time especially to get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I kept a spreadsheet of all the roles I was applying to, and I sometimes scroll down it because I've got it saved in my Google Drive, and I just forget. It sends a bit of a shiver down my spine thinking of the first lockdown, but it was a good experience overall. I learned a lot. So
great. And Gavin, what about you? So what was your journey into tech, and what did that look like? How did you get into it?
Yeah, so I guess it started with a comp sci degree in Durham, way back at the start of the century. Actually, it's now when I talk to new recruits and interns and things like that, I tell them that I graduated in 2001, so I've been doing this for over 20 years, which kind of crept up on me.
Yeah, wow.
It happens. So yeah, quite vanilla really after graduating. I started at a company called Nonlinear Dynamics as a software engineer. It was actually a government kind of training scheme, collaboration with a local university to do some kind of novel work that would be interesting to a university from a research point of view, but also like applicable to a company. But that just transitioned into, so that was a 2-year thing. And it was a mix of learning to be a software developer as well as doing some kind of some research into an algorithm that the company was interested in. So the first kind of 8 to 10 years of my career was different software engineer positions, 2 companies, and just getting more experience, not just on the technical side, but also kind of on the product development side. I did a stint as a project manager working in a software team for 5 years. That was a tricky role. I wouldn't advise it to anybody on the call. I'm still very involved with the software development and the team and the project. We were running Scrum and Agile type processes in that company and in those teams. So still very close to all the mechanics going on around the sprint. And then I came back to the company that I work for now, Waters Corporation. They acquired Nonlinear Dynamics, which is the company that I joined when I left university. They acquired Nonlinear Dynamics in 2013, and I came back here in 2015 as a principal software engineer. And then after a couple of years, I moved across into engineering management. And one of the kind of the main reasons that I switched onto the management side, we were a small group. We still are a small group in Newcastle. But at that point, we were still quite early in the kind of evolution into being a group of teams in a big corporation rather than just being a team of 25 to 30 people in a standalone company. And that transition is difficult, and it can, there are a bunch of interesting challenges there. You want to maintain the things that make a team and a company effective and nimble and good, being a small unit, but you can't ignore the new world and the new reality that you're in. You've got to adopt corporate processes, just corporate culture. And honestly, I looked at that and I thought, well, if this place is going to continue to be a good place to work, then somebody's going to need to think about this and try and do a good job of this integration. And that was what kind of sparked my move into engineering management.
Yeah, great. And did that move to engineering management, did that come as like a natural progression from your day-to-day engineering, or did you go through sort of an interview process? Was there a bit of competition for that position?
I think there wasn't much competition. So at that time, the engineering manager role was a role that Waters used in their software group. And we'd started working more with the wider software group. And we didn't have an engineering manager. We had a kind of 2 or 3 line managers that hung over from the acquisition, and they were engineers. They didn't really want to be line managers. So there was a kind of a drive from the bigger company to introduce that role locally. So we had the option of either taking somebody from the Wilmslow site near Manchester, having somebody at Newcastle take it on, or hiring from outside. So kind of my boss at the time, he knew that me and maybe some other people might be interested in it. He talked to us about it. And yeah, it felt like a good progression for me. Honestly, I was in a team of some really talented software engineers, and I certainly wasn't one of the best software engineers. Not bad, but not one of the best. And so I kind of, in previous roles, at times as a project manager, there were times when I would have preferred to have more of an engineering management role, the hiring, the development, looking at the way that the team's working together rather than some of the less fun parts of project management. So yeah, it was something that I wanted to do, and I think that was a good option.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we'll. It sounds like you've both got a lot of valuable experience, probably coming from different angles at the interview process. So I think we should jump right in. I think there's a lot of, especially for kind of juniors and grads, there's a lot of maybe nervousness, uncertainty, even kind of confusion, especially if you're new to the interview process. So I'm hoping we can clear some of that up for some people. So Asher, yeah. So just moving back to you. So did you know when you were kind of ready to start applying for your first developer job? Because I know you came from this recruitment background, so you obviously had to learn the ropes. When was it that you thought you were ready to give a kind of full-time position a go?
Yeah, good question. I think I started applying for jobs before I thought I was ready, just because I'd read some articles online, watched some videos, and they said at the end of the day, you're going to have to get through the whole sort of technical side of things. And the only way you're going to be able to get better at that is to practice. There's a high probability that, and obviously it's not to say it's always the case, but there's a high probability that you're not going to get the first role that you go for.
Yeah.
So a few months into studying, before I even felt comfortable, with JavaScript, with a JavaScript framework or library, anything like that, I started applying for jobs just to essentially get my CV and profile out there. I built up a full portfolio, started sending around some CVs, cover letters, messaging people on LinkedIn just to see if there was any opportunity for me to get in an interview with someone. The soft side of things, I feel like I can do. It's no problem jumping on a call and having a chat about culture and, my experience, anything like that for an hour with people. But I think the hardest and probably the scariest part for people going into their first interview for a role within tech is just knowing that there's going to be some sort of technical element to it.
Yeah.
So to people out there who are thinking of doing the same, I'd say start applying before you feel like you're ready, because the experience you're going to get from those first few interviews that might not necessarily go as planned, as quite a few of mine didn't at the start, the experience you get from that is invaluable. And
yeah, I think that's a good point. I think it's there's a lot of pressure put on interviews for a good reason. I mean, if you're applying for something you really want, the pressure obviously just increases. But it is a skill at the end of the day, and one to practice. So there is, there are multiple, as you say, multiple interviews needed to build that muscle of being good at interviews in a way. At least early on.
Yeah, 100%. And I think myself and probably everyone in tech has bombed a technical interview before, and you've come off the call thinking that went horribly. But I felt that helps build up a lot of character, it builds up your skills, and yeah, it's definitely worth starting to apply before you feel ready, for sure.
Yeah. What about you, Gavin? Do you remember your first interview as a junior developer, or a recent interview, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, I was thinking about this before. My very first interview was looking back on it from the company's point of view and their interview process. It wasn't particularly good. I remember mostly theoretical questions. I got asked all questions like, "Can you describe encapsulation and tell me about polymorphism?"
Yeah.
And aside from that, it was just kind of the CEO asking what I'd done and what I liked about university and what ideas I had for my career. The next technical interview I had, which was 4 or 5 years later, that was better. I don't remember. I was interviewed by 3 different groups as part of like 45 minutes with this person, then half an hour with the next person. And the technical part of that, I was asked to describe how I'd go about writing an algorithm to detect the outline of an object in an image. And it was just like a pencil and paper thing. But I remember thinking that that felt like a good question to ask in an interview. It's a good problem space, for somebody to explore and talk about how they might go about it. And if not everybody's going to know how to write an object detection algorithm, but the interviewers can kind of guide you. They can ask questions. They can probe into it. So that was probably, as my second technical interview, not a bad example of a good question.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That really makes you think outside the box, because I think the purpose of that is probably not to design the perfect object detection algorithm. The purpose, I imagine, is probably to work out how that person might work. Is their method? What's their approach to this problem?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so I started off, okay, so I'm thinking I might try this, and I'd talk a little bit about it, and I'd say, okay, well, what would you do with that? Then you found this bit, what would you do next?
Yeah.
And the conversation kind of went like that. So I think they did a good job of that interview.
Yeah. That sounds like a very an interesting question. I'm not sure I'd be able to answer that right now. So I think a lot of people, in terms of starting their careers in tech, obviously it's still a very competitive market, and I think there's a term in the recruitment space in tech that more senior techies are a bit like gold dust. It's they have the pick of the bunch of the companies they might want to work for. True to some extent perhaps, but as a graduate developer, how this is a question directed to both. It'd be interesting to get both your takes on this. How does a graduate developer distinguish themselves in what is still a very competitive market?
Yeah, I'll go first.
Sure.
Good question. So I think, and I can't speak from experience of being a graduate developer, but certainly from applying for those first roles, I think you've got to try and leave no stone unturned, so to speak, when it comes to things like that. And you've got to be able to think outside the box. You've got to differentiate yourself from the competition, really. And whether that's, so when I was struggling to hear back from companies by just sending a CV and a cover letter, one idea I came up with was, and I'm sure people have done this before, it's not like I invented it, but one thing I discovered was it might be worthwhile in going to the company's website that you're targeting, looking at, their homepage, anything like that you can almost replicate and put your own spin on. I did that with one company. I went onto their website, had a look around, and I spent a few hours that afternoon just rebuilding a sort of almost like a one pager of the website to attach in a send them over essentially a link alongside my CV and cover letter and say, I'm very interested in this position. I took some time out to put a fresh spin on something from your website, for instance. And I feel like that was just a nice little touch, and it means you've taken the time out, as opposed to, just sending maybe a generic cover letter message along with your CV and not hearing something back. And even though I think a few companies that I did this with didn't get back to me at all, I think it was just quite a nice personal touch, and it shows people that you've taken the time out to really invest in showcasing your skills. So things like that, really, just going the extra mile.
Yeah, definitely. It's about it's exactly that, isn't it? It's going the extra mile, doing over and above what is on the application form, or just sending over the CV. It's how do you get yourself noticed? What do you think, Gavin?
Yeah, so I like to think about this like in two different ways. So you might, if you're a graduate or kind of entry level, there might be jobs out there that are explicitly advertising for graduates, apprentices, entry level positions. And if it's one of those, it's almost like a level playing field then. So if you've got a good CV, a good covering letter, you might not need to do kind of more if you're good and you're happy with your CV and your kind of covering letter. If you're applying for jobs where you're going to be up against people with more experience, especially commercial experience, if that's a tougher battle to win. I think it mostly comes down to the majority of people who are recruiting, certainly us as well. If you have a general role to fill, it's a bigger risk to take somebody on who doesn't have the experience. And whether it's for right or wrong, when you look at somebody's CV, if they've got 3 years, 4 years, 5+ years of experience, you can look at the type of things that they've done. There is a sense of kind of security there, but you can
exactly.
never find out totally what somebody's done from the interview process, but you're on safer ground. So again, following on from what Asher suggested, you've got to do something to stand out. I hadn't thought of that idea of taking something specific to the company. I think that's a good one. Doing a review of some of their work, making a spin on a page on my website. Another option you've got is, I've had questions on LinkedIn about portfolios and how important they are. If you have a good portfolio, that's a good leg in. It's an opportunity to show some of the work that you've done. What I would advise there is include that portfolio and include kind of sample projects if they're good. I don't mean if they're kind of like huge or very involved or like successful in some way, but good in that you could show something about the way that you've worked on them and talk about that. Because at the end of the day, what the company, what the interviewer is looking for is they're looking for signals of things that they want to see in a software engineer that's working in their team and their company.
Yeah, exactly.
And the more that you can do to show that you've kind of ticked some of those boxes despite not having commercial experience, the better.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. I think it's the focus is on your potential and how much of a valuable member of the development team you're going to be, and it's how do you get that into the mind of the company, the employer, the interviewer, whoever it is, without having that initial experience firsthand. So things like how you learn, and again, the portfolio is a great example, because if you can talk through and explain effectively what you've done, and more importantly how you've done it, the time it's taken you, why, even the why of what you've built, it gives a lot of insight into the person you are as a developer, how you actually go about a project, more than just you finished a university course or a bootcamp or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And whether you can fit that in a part of your CV, or whether you put that in the covering letter, but exactly that, explaining why you did something, how you approached it, what you learned, what you went back and reviewed later, how you got other people to give you some feedback. If you can explain your approach to working in a way that is interesting to how they're looking for a new starter to fit into their team, then I think you're on solid ground with that.
Yeah. What do you think the most? And this is maybe one more for you, Gavin, but definitely give your input, Asher, if you've got thoughts on this. But what's the most common mistake you think people make in interviews? Is there any one thing or a couple of things that need to be avoided at all costs?
Yeah.
Multiple things.
So, I mean, take this with like the kind of, it's one person's opinion. Okay. So you might interview at a different company. They might have a different view on this, but myself and the team of people that I interview with here, the biggest red flag is blaming or kind of unprompted negative comments about a place you've worked or like people you've worked in a project. And I'll explain why that is. Like, if you're a hiring manager, if you're building a team, if you have unrest in a team or there's friction between people, if you have somebody who is prone to blaming and isn't good at taking responsibility for things that are kind of in their area of control, it's really difficult. It can really make the team work poorly. And often what happens, or what I've experienced happening in my career, is you might hire somebody and you might not see that behavior until a year later, 2 years later, maybe 6 months later. But you tend not to see it at the start, whilst it's kind of like the probation period. So if somebody is blaming a negative in an interview, like that, it's a real indicator that they're going to have that same behavior in the team. So that's a major red flag. And that's tricky because sometimes you're asked, "Oh, tell me about something that isn't working or something that you'd like to improve." So if you get that question, or there really is something that you didn't like about a previous project or a team member, it's okay to answer it. But here's my advice for that. You might have heard of this kind of idea that if you think about in terms like responsibility and ownership, you've got around you there are a set of things that you have kind of direct control over. And if you don't like something in that area, then it's up to you to make a change. Outside of that, there are things you've got kind of influence on, maybe not direct control, but you have the ability to work with others, to influence, to try and affect change. And outside of that, there might be things that legitimately you can't control. So if you're working in an organization where there's a company-wide policy and you're a junior developer, then okay, that's you can't affect that. So if there's something that you would critique or say like this didn't feel so good, it would have been better if it was changed or if it was improved. Think about before the interview where that lies in your sphere of control, because if it's something that you could control, then be careful of how you talk about it, because I would be thinking, well, what did you try? Tell me about what you tried. How did it work? What did you do when it didn't work out? So it's tricky, but blaming is probably our biggest red flag.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I hadn't thought too much about that, actually, interestingly enough. But yeah, it's almost like as you say, if somebody that early in the interaction does resort to that sort of behavior, you can almost kind of project forward as an employer what that person might be like in your own team.
Real life experience of times in the past when we've come out of an interview and we've said, we're not quite sure about that. How do you... And we went and hired the person, and then it manifested later on.
Right. Yeah.
Been in that situation twice, so I've it's definitely a red flag.
Yeah. How about you, Asher? Do you have any thoughts on common mistakes either you've made or you've kind of heard about in interviews?
Gavin's was spot on, to be honest. Mine was probably from a recruiter's side of things, really more so is, and I think it's probably one of the most basic ones, but it's just, at the end of the day, you've got to do your homework. You know, you can't go into an interview just thinking I'm going to wing it. You need to be prepared. If you don't prepare, then, you know, the amount of calls that I've had from managers following a candidate having interviewed for me for one of their roles, and despite me prepping them and calling them beforehand, making sure they've researched the company, things like that, the manager would just call me and basically say that that person didn't have a clue what we do. So it sounds stupid, but just being prepared and prepping for an interview, like you would for a technical interview, you know, you'd go away, you'd practice, you essentially work on what it is you think you need to know. And it's the same with researching about the company, you know, especially some of like these bigger tech companies, for instance, that you might be interviewing at. They're going to be so much more transparent than they used to be. They're going to have a blog. There's tons of information out there on every company. You know, you can go on Glassdoor and have reviews, find about you know, potential questions that are asked in the interview. Even something as simple as just visiting the company's website, just to see essentially what it is they do in more detail, what their core values are, you know, the sort of integral values that they stand by as well. Being able to come into the interview knowing exactly what it is the company do, that's probably one of the most basic tips, but one that is, I think, easily forgotten.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think especially in smaller companies, especially for example at Haystack, if someone does come into an interview and doesn't know much about the company at all, and doesn't show much passion towards what we're doing, and obviously the things we're trying to affect, that's a red flag. That's a bit of a turn off. That
Yeah,
so it's
exactly.
You know, with a larger company, it may be different, where you don't have to necessarily be passionate about the cause. You know, you can be just a great developer who wants to work in a specific type of development culture. But so it does very much, I think, depend as well on the company that you're interviewing at. I think a smaller company will look for a bit more in terms of not just culture fit, but also just fit with the business itself, its own trajectory and interest in the business in general.
Yeah, you want to feel like people that are interviewing at your company are bought into what it is you do and what you stand for. So, 100% agree.
Yeah, exactly. So, Asher, you've had a different, obviously, move into tech. Gavin, you did a degree initially. So I'm interested to know what some of the pros and cons are of being, you know, self-taught versus going through the degree stage.
When I was due to leave my recruitment job, I actually got accepted into a boot camp in London. It's a boot camp called General Assembly. They're sort of one of the most popular ones that I could find. And I went to their offices, had an interview, everything like that, got accepted. And I sort of decided at the last minute, after doing a bit of networking online, speaking to some people on LinkedIn who had been, that you could pretty much find out how to do everything that they teach there for free online. I think the difference is, and probably the strongest argument for self-taught programmers against going to a boot camp or having a degree, is maybe that sort of freedom and like flexibility to learn on your own time and pursue topics that interest you, as opposed to, you know, going to like a boot camp or getting a degree, for instance, and you probably cover quite a more broad bunch of topics.
Yeah.
But with me, it was essentially, if you want to learn quite quickly and find out how to do something within a month, there's sort of tons of resources online that are free or low cost, and you can essentially fit it within your budget. And even if you're not doing it full time, you can work it around your current job. The best thing about, I guess, going to a boot camp or having a degree is just having that course structure, knowing exactly when you're going to be studying, knowing what time you might have classes, as opposed to trying to do it in your own time. And some people can't do that. You know, some people prefer that structure and prefer going out to a class and integrating with, you know, tons of other people and learning alongside people. Mine was just at the beginning of lockdown, so, you know, I was essentially at home a lot anyway, and it was just time to sit down and do the work. But it might not be for everyone. I think it just depends on the person, what type of route you go down. If you prefer the structure and, you know, knowing exactly what time you're going to be doing something, then boot camp or degree is certainly a way to go. But I think you can certainly get by being self-taught and that's essentially what I've done, and seems to have worked out so far. So
yeah, definitely. What about you, Gavin? What do you think the pros and cons are?
So first, I'll say one of the best developers I know is self-taught. So like it certainly is. It's not a blocker on being successful or being good. Like Asher said, I think if you're self-taught, the freedom is a factor. You can tailor what you're working on, what tech you're working on, how you want to work on that, and arguably a lot of what you would do in a degree isn't going to be of practical use in your first interview, in your first role. So in terms of benefit for amount of time spent learning, that freedom and targeted ability that's a bonus. I think if you have if you have a degree or some kind of like you've completed a course, that will provide interviewers a level of comfort in that you've done certain things. If somebody's done a degree, they're going to have done a dissertation, they're going to have done a group project, they're going to have had people reviewing their work and getting some kind of feedback. So those are things that can give a level of confidence to companies, and it also gives them a bunch of things that they can ask about, and they might have asked similar types of questions to other students with degrees. So they've got kind of got more confidence in their ability to interview and judge a person's abilities and experience.
That's interesting. So they've kind of got a benchmark almost with this kind of similar questions they'll ask everyone.
The idea would be that every team, every hiring manager, every position would be judged for on a kind of case by case merit basis. But it's like the real world isn't like that. Companies are going to have processes that they follow, interview scripts that they use, bands that they're looking for. So if you're self-taught, I go back to the advice, tailoring that kind of learning and development so that you can show things that companies will be interested in. Like if you're a self-taught entry-level developer and a company is willing to like interview you and look at your skills and your abilities, do your best you can to show them things that will be valuable if you were to start next month working in their team. So it's going to be things like working on an application where you've done a thing end to end and you had a reason that you wanted to do it and you thought about the requirements of the thing. Maybe you use source control and you learned some things there. Maybe you started off with one piece of tech and you had to change for some reason. You can talk about that and what the options were. Maybe there was some tricky code and you got it reviewed by a friend or somebody who's already in the industry. Look for things that developers will be doing in the day-to-day work and try and show that in your own learning and your own portfolio, because that's one of the things that university students don't always have. Like they tend not to talk about refactoring, which is a huge thing in software development. So if you're self-taught and your portfolio, think about refactoring, think about architecture, and have it so that what you present in your cover letter and your portfolio and your CV kind of hints at that, and be prepared to talk about it, because that's your way in. Like you can really, you can direct your learning, you can direct what you work on, and try and show the signals that like an interviewer will be looking for.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're immediately showing you've got sort of practical knowledge of how a development team works in that sense as well.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of last questions, then we'll open up to anyone who has a question. So the last two questions are really about getting into the sort of insider knowledge and see if we can kind of peek behind the curtain, as it were. So it's about obviously the end of an interview. Everyone knows you should ask questions. That's the whole thing. Where asking pertinent questions. I think the question of what's a typical day look like is the standard one people like to ask. Don't, in my opinion, I don't think that really distinguishes you much from the crowd. It's better to ask that than nothing. But I wanted to ask. So at the end of when the candidate does ask a question, I suppose this first one's more directed to you, Gavin. Have there been any questions that you've been asked that have impressed you or surprised you or really gave you pause really in a positive way?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this before. Probably the one that surprised me the most. So it was an interview panel. There were three of us, and the candidate asked us each to describe the hardest thing that we'd worked on. And having not thought about that before the interview, we each took a bit of time to think, okay, what is kind of the hardest technical thing I've worked on in my career? I don't know how much.
That's a good one.
It is a good question. I don't know how much value they got from it, but that was I was interested by that. I think this next question gets asked not all the time, but more than once. Some people ask the interviewers what they like most about working at the company. So they'll say, "What do you like most about working at Waters?" Yeah. I think that's a good question, because when you're interviewing, part of your job is to kind of, aside from doing the best you can in the interview, is to try and work out whether the team and the company is actually a place that you want to work for. And if I ask that question in an interview, I'd want the interviewers to talk with passion about something. And if you get like rubbish answers and there's no passion in what they're talking about, and that might be a red flag for working at that company. So I think when people ask that, I think that's a smart question to ask.
Yeah, great. Asher, have you cracked the code with any interview questions of your own at the end when they ask if you've got any questions?
I don't think so, to be honest. Mine are always pretty basic, which is bad having the few years recruitment experience. But I like to try and dig a little bit deeper into finding out about the team around me. That's usually a question I like. What's the team around me like? Who would I be working with on a daily basis? I guess that gives you a good indication of how the company's structured, who you report into, the sort of department the role sits within, and depending on that response, it also gives you sort of an opportunity to mention some of your experience and how that might fit in there, or some success you've had in the past working in a similar team.
Yeah.
And another one I quite like is more so, instead of asking what the company's plans are for growth and development, which I think is a pretty standard one, is asking maybe how the company's changed over the last few years instead. And that gives you an indication of their sort of mission and their vision, and how they're adapting to that, and how they've adapted to that over the last few years, and essentially the sort of direction that they're headed in.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think I would add that, like, when you get an opportunity to ask questions at the end, you've got two goals there. One is to do some fact finding yourself and learn about the company. It's really important. And the other is to continue to sell yourself. And generally, at the end of an interview, I like questions from candidates that reveal things that they're interested in. So somebody might ask about, could you describe what's a typical pull request look like? And that immediately tells me that they're interested in pull requests. Like, some developers will come and they've never done a pull request before, never had their code reviewed. So in terms of selling yourself, it's a good opportunity to kind of indicate things that you value in software development.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I think what I'll do is I'll open up to any questions that we have finally. So if anyone does have any questions, I believe Alice can make them a speaker. Is that how it works?
Yes, so someone can just request to speak, and then I'm able to give them control. Okay,
great. So if there is any questions, can someone put their hand up? If that is how it works. I do actually have one other question just on the interview while people are thinking of questions. So it's kind of on the same topic. So the end questions that the kind of candidates are encouraged to ask at the end. Obviously, in the interview itself, Gavin, in terms of the questions that you ask, do you have a favorite question, a favorite interview question? Is there something at Waters that you wouldn't mind disclosing in terms of something that you think elicits that value from candidates in terms of what you want to know?
Yeah, sure. So it's a generic question, but the question I like best is, tell me more about that. And how that works is, for every candidate that we interview, I'll go through the CV looking for things that I want to drill into. Depending on how experienced they are, what grade they are, I'm looking for depth and critical thinking and how they've approached some piece of work. And if they're a junior, then I'm just like looking for small hints. If they're a senior and they've called out 5 things on the CV, I want them to be able to talk like really well about 2 or 3 of them. And so you ask a question and just tell me more about that, and we're digging into the details. So that would be general advice, I guess, for your CV is put things on there that you really want to talk about. It's an opportunity to guide the interviewer towards things that you're confident and comfortable with.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I think we've got a couple of questions here, if I'm not mistaken. I think we've got Danny and John. Danny, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. It's been really good. So one of the questions I had was, I've been asked a couple of times in interviews to think about kind of, I guess, the last time I've made a mistake in a role I've had in the past. So I was wondering, because I've always found that quite a difficult question, how the both of you would approach that question.
Is that like kind of how last time I've made a mistake in my role as an engineering manager, or if I was imagining that I was in interviewing for a software engineer, like what I might say?
I guess so, more so as a software engineer.
All right. Good question. I might have to note that down and ask people that in the future. I think so. People learn by making mistakes. So hopefully the company that you're working for, that you're interviewing for, they have a culture where it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to learn, it's okay to adapt. Sometimes with interview questions, something to bear in mind, by the way, the people doing the interviewing, they're not perfect at it. And they'll have a bunch of questions and they'll ask them. And sometimes they totally flop. And it's not your fault if you're being interviewed and the question just isn't very good or it's not easy to answer. So bear that in mind. If you get a question and there isn't an obvious way to answer it, not necessarily your fault. And don't feel bad about it. Try not to let it knock you off your stride. But that question, if I was asking somebody, tell me about a recent mistake and how you dealt with it, I'd be interested in how you kind of detected that something was suboptimal. So like maybe you pushed something without getting a code review first. So how did you detect the mistake or a misstep? And how did you think about it afterwards? Like, did you get some like a colleague or your manager to kind of, hey, I did this, it felt like I could have done that better. What do you think? So did you get some like third party opinion on that? Did you reflect on it yourself? How did you go about not repeating the mistake in the future? So is it the type of thing where it happens infrequently? So maybe use like OneNote or some note-taking process. I put that down, so I'll come back to that. I put a calendar reminder in for like 2 weeks' time. Like how did you assess the misstep? Like what did you think about it? And how did you go about improving that in the future so maybe it doesn't happen again, or next time you've kind of got the guidance or you've learned from it?
Yeah, and going on what Gavin said, essentially, I think when employers ask this, it's them just trying to see how you handle challenging situations. Admitting your mistake shows a good sense of like integrity, which is probably one of the major traits that employers look for when interviewing people. Is this person honest? Can they admit when they're wrong, and what is it they do to rectify that? In my experience, I think the key to answering that question is less about what the actual mistake was and more just giving you the opportunity to show the employers that you've learned from that mistake. And that's how they sort of try and identify weaknesses and how you might overcome them. So it's all about outlining the mistake, describing your actions to rectify it, and then building upon your strengths. That would be my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I think Ash is spot on with even just as simple as being able to admit that you made a mistake. It doesn't really matter what it is, but some people really struggle with that. So yeah, that's spot on, Asher.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's definitely a valuable trait to look for as an employer. I think first and foremost, I mean, you've got the honesty level of the question where it's about someone admitting first and foremost to making that mistake, and then, but it's also how do you handle pressure as well? What were your steps to rectify? What the issue was, or whatever it was that happened? And just allowing someone to be a little bit vulnerable in the interview, and kind of judging on a little bit more of a qualitative level, I think. So yeah, I think it's a great question. So we've got another question from John.
Hi. Thanks for spending a chunk of your evening with us. Danny stole my question. It was a good question. But I've got another one. If you were to apply for, if you had to apply for a job right now, if you were to, start from scratch and, you were building a portfolio, you were going to start applying for jobs. If you were going to build one project which you think would set you apart, what would you build?
Oh, interesting. Who wants to take that one? Gavin?
So, first of all, I would think about if you're interested in a certain type of job, a certain domain, a certain tech stack, start there. If it's a certain type of company, go and look at those companies and see what tech stack they're using. Like, you can use job adverts or your own kind of passion to kind of direct you towards like a domain or a tech stack. So there's something in the choice of what tools you're using to build. After that, so part of this is going to come down to how much time you've got. If you're doing this in your evenings and around a current job, the thing that you build doesn't have to be huge. You don't have to build an app that's going to be super successful and loads of people are going to know about and use. I'd pick something that you're interested in yourself, so that from a motivational point of view, that's going to keep you going with it. It'll also help you in talking about it if it comes to that in the interview process, why you built it, how you thought about the requirements. Something that you can complete end to end. So don't bite off something that's too big that's going to look unfinished. So something that is achievable with your current skills and the time you've got available. And then after that, going back to that advice again, try and think about the aspects of a professional software engineering role, which is going to include some requirements, some design, getting some feedback, code reviews, thinking about the architecture, writing tests. And you don't have to do all those things, but show in some way that you either did them or considered them. So I would say that the important thing is to pick something that is rounded and gives you the opportunity to practice and also show the attributes and the kind of the skills of a software engineer's job.
Yeah, and I think adding on that, what helped me land my first role in tech is I was taking some inspiration of real world events and what was happening essentially in the world around us. One of the projects I built throughout lockdown, which was very basic, and it was quite obvious looking at the final project that I was very early on in my career, but it doesn't have to be anything that's going to be used by millions of people around the world or anything like that. I built a COVID-19 tracker during lockdown, and it was very basic. It just tracked sort of cases in different countries in the world using an API. But that's something I stuck on my portfolio, and when I was interviewing, I got asked about that quite a bit, and that helped me land my first role. And it was just taking something that, obviously that's a problem. That was a problem at the time to the world, but even if it's something that you have a bit of an emotional attachment to, where it solves a problem, then you're able to talk about it and sort of describe why it was important to you and how you focused on, the tech stack that you used to build it and what type of problem it solves. And just having an actual problem-solving application on your portfolio that means something to you is a really good talking point, and it shows the employer that you really care and that you're essentially trying to solve problems, which is a big aspect of what a developer does, is solving problems. So that was sort of my take on it.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. I think we'll leave it there. This has been great. So thanks to everyone who's joined us. We had a few technical issues to begin with. I think we lost a few people, but we got there in the end. And yeah, huge thanks to Asher and Gavin. This has been a great conversation.
You're welcome.
Thanks
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having us.
Nice one. Great. Right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Take care. See ya.